Hi, everyone. Welcome to Thanks for Sharing. I am your host, Jackie Pack, and I'm happy to share this podcast episode that I recorded with Michelle Wingle over at the Wholeness Network. It has been a while since I have collaborated or been invited to collaborate with somebody else who's doing podcasts and who's putting out good work into our universe. And it was fun to do. And so I wanted to introduce you. So I wanted to introduce you to the Wholeness Network so you can check them out and find out more about them. The Wholeness Network empowers people with knowledge, tools, and techniques that will help raise the quality of all aspects of their life, filling it with wholeness and peace. And so you can find them on YouTube, you can find them on social media platforms, and I would encourage you to go check them out, learn more about them. And I hope you enjoy this podcast episode on attachment, how attachment impacts our relationships, and just understanding more about your attachment styles. So here is the podcast and enjoy.
Wholeness means to me being in a state of joy.
Wholeness means feeling complete, owning my authentic gifts.
Wholeness is really connected. Everything is connected to everything.
Wholeness is where we have access to all parts of ourselves.
Jackie Pack, or in our family, everybody knows who we mean when we just say Jackie. We don't need any other words to describe her, has been our therapist, me and my husband, since 2019. And she has been an influence on the health and wholeness of me, my husband, my children, and even the third generation, our little baby, grandbaby Casey. There might not be an us without Jackie's help, and I am forever grateful. And I don't know if that gratitude will ever be enough. One of the things I've admired about her over the years is her willingness to walk the path along with us, to let us feel like we're not alone. In fact, she shares in this conversation that seeking her own healing is part of what brought her to the role of therapist, like so many of us in the healing arts. She has a talent to share just enough to make you feel safe and able to move toward healing while allowing each of our individual authentic selves to guide the way. It's quite the magic. Jackie is the owner of Healing Paths, 2 different offices that she runs and oversees therapists. And she is an expert at treating behavioral and substance addiction and relationship issues and trauma. You would be surprised how often those things overlap, and she is the perfect person because of all that overlap to come and teach us more about this attachment style model. The way she describes it is different from the book Attached, and we wanted to actually reference that. It's like the same ideas, but different wording. And so we wanted to have her kind of explain the attachment system in this different way to understand the attachment system and how important it is to our relationships, not only with others, but with ourselves. At the beginning of our conversation, she shares a graphic that's really useful. So I really encourage you to go and join the Wholeness Library so that you can see it. It's only $5.55 a month, cheaper if you pay for the whole year, and you get a free trial. So use that to your advantage so that you can get the most out of this episode.
Attachment theory started mainly with John Bowlby in the 1950s, maybe late 1940s, after World War II. And he was looking particularly at kids who had been separated from their families because of the war and different things like that. And so that's really the origin of attachment theory. If you wanted to go deep into that, John Bowlby also has explored his own family of origin dynamic and how the attachment, like his own attachment issues and how attachment was done in his family of origin as well. And then in the 1970s, we had Mary Ainsworth, and she's the one who actually created the attachment styles. Mm-hmm. Building on the work of John Bowlby, she created the attachment styles. Okay, so the attachment styles can be confusing. People will use a lot of different labels for the different quadrants of attachment style. I feel like a lot of the words the words may be different, the labels may be different, but the descriptions are often similar. So typically we talk about 4 attachment styles. These are the ones that I use. This is the wording taken from the emotional connection or emotional close relationships assessment. So that's the one that we use, and this is at our office, and these are the words that particular one uses. There's also different people who, since Mary Ainsworth came along and introduced the attachment styles, there's different people who have developed attachment theories, not necessarily different than John Bowlby or what Mary Ainsworth were saying, but that's where we get some of the different wording and different labels, is because they are putting their wording into that, their model into that. So basically we have secure attachment, and then we have insecure attachment. And under the insecure attachment styles, we see that divided out in a couple of ways. So if you also see on this image, we're basing, or Mary Ainsworth was basing the attachment styles off of avoidance in relationships and anxiety in relationships. So with secure attachment, you can see up at the top that there's a low avoidance that would, outline that secure attachment. There's also low anxiety. So in secure attachment, we don't have a lot of avoidance. We're feeling okay in relationships. We can lean in. We know how to connect and be relational. Often I will say we know the attachment language. And usually we learn that in secure attachment because we grew up in a family where the attachment language was spoken. And, if we didn't grow up in that type of family of origin, that we can learn the attachment language, and we can move back towards secure attachment. It just takes some work. Right. So on the other side, let's move over to the right of secure, where we have preoccupied. So this type of person is really focused on relationships. It's kind of that saying of, if my relationship's okay, I'm okay. If my relationship's not okay, I'm not okay. So that person is going to be leaning in to stabilize the relationship in order to decrease the anxiety that they're feeling. And their anxiety is very much centered on the connection they feel in this relationship. So they're dependent on others for their self-worth. They're dependent on the relationships in their life, whether that's a romantic partner or whether that's a friend. They are, dependent on those relationships to feel okay in themselves. And so there is this approach that is oriented towards other people and focused on other people to then make the person feel less anxiety. So there is high anxiety, but not low avoidance.
Right.
And then if we move down under preoccupied, this one is fearful, or we call it fearful avoidant. Sometimes it's called anxious avoidant. Both preoccupied and fearful are on the higher end of anxiety. One is low avoidant, the other one's a high avoidant, right? So for the fearful avoidant, they will, if they feel anxiety in the relationship, they tend to take a step back. They tend to distance in order to decrease their anxiety. Whereas the preoccupied leans in and tries to stabilize the relationship. You can see how if these two people get in a relationship with each other, which I think is fairly common, that can lead to a lot of conflict because one person is leaning in to stabilize, and the more they lean in, the more the other person tries to distance.
Yep. That's familiar.
Yeah.
Yeah, totally.
And typically, I mean, both of them would have grown up with some anxiety or some fear around attachment and intimacy, that close, getting really close. And it's just, I don't know that we are clear on why one would go preoccupied. That probably has something to do with their biology and temperament and personality. It also maybe has something to do with the roles in their family and some of the, the way the family was organized. So in fearful avoidant, they, neither of these people have a lot of self-esteem. But for the one person, the anxiety is really about getting too close and being rejected. And for preoccupied, it's about getting too close because otherwise I feel that distance, and that makes me very anxious.
And I feel like the preoccupied, like we talk about, if you an anxious types person or style is like, it's almost like that junior high little girl that like, I am you, you are, you know, like they don't have like that sense of self. It's like, what do you like? What do you want to do?
Yeah.
How about you? I mean, and
well, or you'll see these in media. I mean, I always think of the one, and this came out a long time ago, but Jerry Maguire, the whole concept of you complete me.
Yeah.
Or one more recently that I've seen is like, I need you to hold me until all of my broken pieces fall back in place, or something like that. Again, that's that preoccupied attachment style that feels like that could be true. Like if we could just get close enough and that would decrease my anxiety, then I would be okay and I'd be whole as a person.
Right.
And we are as human beings, we are created and we're wired for attachment. So it's not entirely wrong, but the way they're going around it is not going to get them the results that they're looking for. Because underneath the attachment is anxiety.
That maybe could you say even like this discomfort of being alone, like I can't handle this aloneness or separateness. Okay. Where the fearful kind of feels those same things, but their tendency is like, okay, fine, I won't like you if you don't like me, kind of a thing. They don't like engage, or
they may be the first one to end it. If they feel like it's headed to there, they may beat you to the point. And they may be wrong that the relationship wasn't ending. There might have just been some conflict or some differences. They're going to overread that as this is headed towards attachment or towards rejection, and then they'll just beat you to the punch. So sometimes they will, kind of do that situation where, again, there is that fearfulness of being too close. If I'm too close, I'm going to get rejected.
Right. Which some people would just, would that be considered the avoidant attachment style? That's another word for avoidant. Okay. And then preoccupied is anxious.
I'll call it fearful avoidant, anxious avoidant. It gets several different labels there, but it's really about creating space to reduce the anxiety. And then that top one is about leaning in and connecting to reduce the anxiety.
But both of them are not addressing that anxieties there. Like the real underlying thing is anxiety.
And they're not addressing the original attachment wounds.
Right. Okay. Right. They're trying to fix it with this new person. You're fixing all my bone. You're holding me until all my parts come together. Well, the fact is we're skipping over the part that the parts got away from you. We're not looking at that. Okay.
Yeah. And often they may not even know this is an attachment style that goes back really young years and needs to be healed.
Right.
So then you go over and there's the dismissing quadrant. So this person would have low anxiety about relationships, but they're pretty still high avoidant. So that person can be overly self-reliant. They might have that awareness that like, I like a relationship, but I'm also not scared of being on my own, and maybe feel even safer being on their own. So they can dismiss some of their relational needs or their attachment needs. I mean, it can be, sometimes this can look pretty abusive, whether that's emotionally or verbally or physically. And they're just not aware of that. They're not really feeling the anxiety, which for the preoccupied and fearful, that anxiety is the mover. And that's what's, getting them to act in their attachment style. We would still say for the dismissing one, there's still that high avoidance, but they're not recognizing that as much because there's the absence of anxiety, or the anxiety's just much lower.
So like lots of one night stands, like,
Mhm.
not too long of relationships, and
Mhm.
just I'm proud to be I'm so self-sufficient. I don't need anybody, like that's
Right.
that kind of thing to an extent, but it's messing with connection. It's messing with
Mhm.
our attachment. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. And that person would go into relationships still overly emphasizing themselves as an individual
Mm-hmm.
and not really developing that relational piece.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. They don't
Where,
see a
like,
need for it.
yeah, sometimes we would say with preoccupied, they go into connection and lose autonomy.
Right.
They lose themselves to the connection. Whereas
Mm-hmm.
with the dismissing, they are holding on too much to their autonomy,
Mm-hmm.
and it's getting in the way of them being relational.
Right. Right. And I think what's interesting in kind of studying this more this last couple months is just the fact that if you think about, we have this attachment system, we need, like you said, we're built for attachment. And so, um, so it's not always pleasant to be like, there's a lot of work that has to go on to be this dismissing type person.
Mm-hmm.
Like that they have to go against this biological need within themselves to keep up that facade. And maybe that's why, they can blast out mean things or be abusive in different ways, because they're trying to suppress that need within them that is just the natural part of humans.
Yeah. If I'm working with those clients, I might see some relational stuff a couple times a year.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, they do tell me they're doing it way more often, but I can feel it. I can feel the way they come into session and talk to me about their relationship. And when they're there, I'm like, oh, you've heard me. Like, you're just like doing it. And, often they will say to me, like, I'm not doing anything different. And I say, yes, you are, because I can feel you.
Right.
And usually I can't feel you. Like, you engage with me intellectually, but I cannot actually feel you.
Interesting. Yeah. Wow. Yeah.
And they just think I'm crazy.
Yeah,
like,
of course.
Whatever, Jackie.
But I get exactly what you're saying. Yeah. It's like there was just this stone wall, and now it's not. I don't know how else to explain it, but it's not there. Yeah. Okay. That's fascinating. So if we talk about these different styles, now that we have a good
let me say one last thing.
Okay,
so
good.
Over here I have on the low anxiety. So that person has a fairly positive model of themselves. They see themselves fairly positively. With the high anxiety, usually the anxiety is high because they're having a negative image of themselves. And that's what they're navigating around in their relationships, is that negative model that they have of themselves. And so again, we have to, if we're not addressing that negative model of self, or for the dismissing person, if we're not expanding that positive image of themselves to include a partner, then we're not actually getting to some of those root sources or those attachment wounds that created the insecure attachment in the first place.
Right. So it's interesting, this graph, because so is it possible that someone, like it's almost like the XY axis, that someone would be, a little bit here and a little, like it wouldn't be at the far ends, but they would be somewhere within those kind of quadrants. Like, that can happen.
So there is like, in the ECR attachment style assessment, it plots them like if you would see a graph paper, right? So they might be in that fearful avoidant category, but close to the preoccupied line.
Right.
Or they might be close to the dismissing line.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes much more sense. Yeah.
And often, like again, this has something to do with the attached or the population that I mostly work with. Often, if they land in secure attachment early on, that is fantasy. Like we have a fantasy self operating. Still that positive model of self. And again, sometimes that indicates to me often that they're probably in that dismissing quadrant. But their positive model for themselves, it puts them in the secure quadrant. If I talk to a partner, I would get a different story.
Right. Oh,
or
interesting. Yeah.
Just when they're coming in and talking to me about why they're coming to therapy, I know they're not securely attached.
Right.
Yeah.
And so is this is like a huge part of like in your world therapy, like this is one of the pieces that kind of gets addressed with almost everybody that walks in the door. Would you say that's true? Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. I think most people, if they've gone to therapy, they've heard about attachment theory, they've heard about attachment styles. Sometimes, can I stop sharing this?
Yeah.
Are we good?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
Sometimes when I'm working with a client who has been to maybe several other therapists before they ended up working with me, it wasn't clearly explained to them. Or I feel like I'm the first therapist who has said, also, your attachment style is not permission to stay there.
Mm-hmm.
Like in therapy, our goal is to move back towards and earn back a secure attachment. That's what healing should be doing, is that we are able to move back to a secure attachment. We are still going to have those default settings.
Right.
But we should be able to have another response that's more secure. Yeah. And then I would also say the attachment styles, like we talk about them in as if they are clearly identified in quadrants and they don't move. And that's not really true.
Right.
So one of my colleagues, she identifies with the preoccupied attachment style, has, done a lot of her own work to move more towards a secure. But she will say, if I am around my mom who is extremely preoccupied, I become a little bit more avoidant.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
So
I can see that.
And maybe not moving into that quadrant, but maybe moving more between or closer to that line between the two.
Right.
So, yeah.
Right. You can act a different, like there can be a moment of a different attachment style.
Yeah. Or
even if you're secure.
Somebody else being really focused on you can heighten that anxiety to get you moving more towards creating some distance.
Right. Interesting. Yeah. Well, then that's perfect segue, because I kind of wanted to talk about how these attachment styles might inform different kind of relationships for us. So like you brought up that parent, how does that affect your relationship with your parent, and how is that different than maybe others? We'll go through some other types, but like what are some scenarios, or how does that show up in a relationship with a parent? Your attachment style
for let's say an adult child or a young child.
Yeah, let's say an adult. An adult.
Yeah. Again, this is the person who helped create this attachment style, right? So it's hard to not go to that same place, especially if that parent hasn't changed at all or had any awareness or insight into themselves and can't hear you talk about some of the things that didn't happen enough or happened that maybe shouldn't have. So it's very hard for people sometimes to not go right back to that role and that attachment style that that was created for them growing up.
Right. That's like that's the programming deep down inside.
Yeah.
To show up a certain way. It's really hard to go against that programming.
Yeah. I think sometimes too, when we look at family systems, and I will combine a lot of theories sometimes.
Right.
And when I talk to other professionals in the field, they're like, oh yeah, that you're breaking some rules, but that's a very interesting concept. And I'm like, I didn't realize there were rules here.
But they do overlap. I think it's smart.
Right.
They totally overlap. Yeah.
And why would we learn one theory and not be able to put that in with other things that we are learning and focused on?
Right.
It makes sense to me.
Yeah.
So we know that there are typically 3 types of family systems, family styles, right? And I think we could see some of this. It's not like a 1 + 1 = 2, like it's not clearly delineated, but we have, so the healthy family in family systems theory talks about the adaptive family. The family is adaptable and they can, adapt to life circumstances, world circumstances. They can adapt to individual needs of the kids. So that would be the healthy family. It's just called the adaptive family system. Then you have the enmeshed family system. So this might be preoccupied to the extreme, the whole family system. But you could also get a kid out of that family system who felt smothered by that enmeshment, or in their mind, they were smothered by the closeness which we would say it's not really closeness. It was a smothering. It was enmeshment. And it didn't allow you to develop as a person because you were enmeshed in this family system. And so for that part, like some of those kids may go right towards avoidant because that like closeness feels way too triggering, and it actually feels smothering because that's what it was growing up. And so they move towards that avoidant attachment style. The third type of family system would be a disengaged is what we call it. So, you know, in the family systems model, they're looking at closeness and distance. And so in a disengaged family system, there's too much distance between the family members. So some of those kids may overcorrect and go towards the preoccupied.
Trying to fill that gap. Trying to fill that gap.
Or the distance made them feel anxious. But they haven't really learned where that healthy balance is between closeness and space.
Right. So this enmeshed family, let's pause for a minute. So the enmeshed family is more like we all like the same team. We all like everybody's in their business. It's like you don't have as much privacy. Like, how would you define those two things just so we can, even understand that a little more?
Typically in an enmeshed family system, you usually have one maybe parent figure, one authority figure who is requiring the enmeshment. And you might have another one that enmeshed parent engages with as a way to reinforce that engagement. So there's a lot more identity as a family. And there's not enough adaptability for each family member to develop their own sense of self. Our identity is as a family.
That's a good example. That's a good way of saying it. And I know everybody's like going, I can think of a few. And you can have systems like even at work where you might be more enmeshed and things like that. Like it's systems. So
work is a very common place to act out family dynamics. Because there usually is built in some hierarchical positions. So people can project onto those people their parent issues, or they can act like that rebellious child. It's a very easy place to replicate family dynamics.
For sure. And then what was the enmeshed, and then I can't remember what was disengaged. So that so that would show up as like, you're on your own, like your parent never even knows what your homework, what homework's due at what time, or like they're not,
like basically you have a place to live, and some basic needs may be provided for, maybe not, but some basic needs may be provided for. You get clothes. You might even get to play on a competitive sports team or do an expensive like dance or tennis or those things that cost a lot of money. But there's not that emotional engagement. So it's going to feel somewhat empty. And they will grow up feeling like close relationships feel empty. And that would create some anxiety. And that would not feel good.
And I'm assuming that there's some families that dip in both, kind of take the worst of both worlds and mix them together. Is that true?
Sometimes you get an enmeshed parent and the other parent goes disengaged. So you grow up with both. Sometimes the enmeshed parent feels safer because they're more present. But it's still enmeshed, right? It's not, we wouldn't say it's healthy, and you have to comply with that parent's expectations of you and how you perform in order to make them feel good. Which is what gets in the way of developing that
your own self. Yeah, for sure. Okay. So also, what about friends? I mean, how would those attachment styles show up with friends?
I mean, it depends on how, like with somebody who is avoidant, their friends may feel, there's a wall that nobody gets behind. And that may work for the most part in the relationship. It would be good if friends could talk about that in a way that felt safe enough that person had that awareness and maybe could practice doing it a little bit differently. But sometimes that person really is not aware of that and might just hear that as a criticism of self, and they already have that negative image of self.
Mm-hmm.
And so,
Mm-hmm.
you know,
Yeah.
then they might start distancing even more from the friendship.
Yeah. Or in preoccupied, maybe it's like, what are we doing
Mhm.
tonight? What are we doing tonight? Like
Yep.
we're together every night. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And they're always checking on you. And like, if you have a problem, like maybe it's not a huge problem in your life, but like if you're engaged in a conversation, you mention like, oh, I've got this situation at work, and they're trying to fix it for you.
Mm,
Right. They're overly involved, and you maybe like, wow, like it's not that big of a deal. And
right.
I can handle it. I'm able to deal with this. Right.
Right.
Um,
Right.
So yeah, that preoccupied friend is going to overly focus on this problem.
Right. Right.
Because that would feel like a threat to them too, because they're reading this as a threat to their friend,
Mm-hmm.
and that's a threat to them.
Right. 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 Okay. And then what about, we talked a little bit about the work and the business world, but maybe like your boss, your authority figure, maybe your coworkers, how does it show up
Mhm.
there?
Yeah, I can get pretty messy. I mean, I think my experience is there's a lot of toxic work cultures.
Mm-hmm.
And I think if we look at, and they will say in family systems theory, worldwide, it divides out to a third, and a third,
Mm-hmm.
which
Mm-hmm.
means we have 2/3 of not healthy families, not
Right.
adaptive families, right? Whether
Right.
that's enmeshed or disengaged, that's 2/3.
Mm-hmm.
So to me, that makes sense why we have a lot of toxic work cultures.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. After the pandemic, you had a lot of stay at home, work from
Mhm.
home types of things, which probably would have been really great for people that were in that dismissive, those kind, but like for preoccupied type people, that was probably devastating. That was probably, and if you happen to have a boss who sits in that preoccupied space, you're probably back at work. You're really
Yeah.
back in the office now,
Yeah.
when you
Yeah.
might not need to. Who knows?
right,
But
right. Yeah.
yeah.
Or they may have just switched that preoccupied because I'm not able to have that at work. So now I'm overly focused at home.
Yep. Yeah, that makes sense. So, okay. And then of course with our spouse or, our partner or especially our love relationships, like
Mhm.
how does it show up, and what is it like to be in these different quadrants? How would you show up? What does it maybe feel like? I don't know. I mean, we're generally talking, but, what is that like?
Mhm. I mean, I think with both of the ones that are driven by anxiety,
Mm-hmm.
there's going to always be a level of anxiety that's there.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Because there is anxiety around attachment.
Mm-hmm.
And so that is always kind of there in the room, having to be navigated, and they may not even be aware of that.
Yeah. Because it was developed under anxiety. So once it's
Right.
developed under anxiety, that's your main middle point. Like
Right.
like that's your set point. So yeah. Mm-hmm.
And with a lot of clients, when they're talking about anxiety and they're feeling it, right?
Mhm.
It's present in their life.
Mhm.
And I will ask them, like, how far back does that emotion go?
Mm,
That one usually is one that goes like, they're like, that goes all the way back.
right.
Like, as far as I can remember, that's there.
Mhm.
So they're always navigating their anxiety in the world, in
Mhm.
relationships.
Yeah.
Sue Johnson was one. She came around in probably the 70s and 80s.
Mhm.
She's Canadian. I think she passed away last year, I believe.
Oh, wow.
Last year. Yeah. And so she was one of the first ones in the field actually to say, hey, these attachment styles in childhood, I think, continue into adulthood.
Oh, wow.
And that was a revolutionary idea. And she got a lot of pushback. Now,
of course.
the field at that time was mostly male dominated. And so
Right.
again, her being a female in the field, and talking about, hey, I think adults carry that same attachment style as they developed as kids. And that is what is playing out
Mhm.
when we're doing couples work,
Mhm.
are these attachment styles. Yeah, she got a lot of, it didn't ruin her career, obviously,
Right.
but she got a lot of pushback initially.
Right. I mean, I'm not surprised by that for sure.
Yeah.
Sadly.
Yeah. Yeah.
Sadly, but yeah, that's fascinating. And yeah, so once we know our style, once we can, and I mean, like I say, you'll go around that little quadrant and there's a part of you that'll be like,
Uh-huh.
you'll recognize a little piece of it.
Yep.
Once you kind of recognize that, and we even in the other episode, we linked to like one of those tests you could take, one of those.
Which I usually tell my clients, like, those will get you pretty much in the right quadrant. Like any of those free attachment style assessments you could Google and find, they're going to do a pretty good job. Of like putting you in the right quadrant. Right.
Giving you a place to start. So once we know that, like, how do we use that to improve our relationships? And I know it's going to be different for different styles, but like, what can we do once we learn it? And just, you're probably going to say this, but I think one of the first things that, you know, I think happens, it's like, now I know my style, okay, let's fix the relationship. But I think part of the understanding is that we got to do some work here first. Like, once you know your attachment style, the work that really needs to happen is inside ourselves first. So I get that, and you can talk about that or reference that however you want. But how does it also work in that relationship?
I mean, it can get pretty ugly, right? Those can be very weaponized. And
true.
And used against each other once we kind of have that information. Because again, going back, I'll hate it when I say the word again, but going back into childhood is very scary. Going back to the origin of our attachment style feels very scary. And so I will fight with you, and maybe I love you a lot, but I will fight with you to avoid going back and having to look at what's there. That scared me. That scared me.
I wonder why. I wonder, how can we get to a place where that's not so scary? Like, and I think part of it is because we make therapy so big, you know, that it's like, but like, that's a really big, really big, difficult thing for people. Like, it is, there is just this part of the system that says, no, you know, we are not going to do that. And yet the thing is, and you've said before, plenty of times to us, like, you're never going to meet someone you don't recognize there. It's not going to be this explosion of, I didn't even know, you know, like, really, it's really someone, you know, it's you.
It's going to feel good.
You're
going to like this person that you find at your core. You'll more clearly see how you had to adapt or change some of that. We may find an underdeveloped core self, and that's fine. Let's start there, right? Like that core self was supposed to develop. So actually, if that's underdeveloped because trauma happened really early, we can go back, and that if we can like remove the barriers that kept them from acting from that core inner essence, then that will develop. Like, our body is designed to do that. Our nervous system is designed to do that. So we're also working, you know, with the biology of the body, that like with physical injuries and physical wounds, our body is designed to heal those. And that's similar with emotions. They just usually, like emotional things like trauma or attachment wounds, they just get buried under those. Because often with attachment wounds, you know, kids are so, and they'll say attachment is pretty, like, our attachment styles are pretty fully set between the ages of 8 to 10. Some people will put it like, unless something significantly different happens, the first 3 years of life have set that. So this is where some people will talk about, like some experts in the field will say, if we know that, like, we could technically say every child has a different set of parents, even in the same family. Because what's happening in the world for the parents when that child is 0 to 3. And if we have 2/3 of families, you know, in this unhealthy quadrant, how do we expect to get, you know, I mean, and then we have a third, that third, you're going to have maybe illness shows up, maybe, you know, anything else shows up that could affect that. Like, we need to understand that we don't have all the tools to develop healthy, you know, we can develop these things. And so it's not about, like, this is almost like, it's like if we could almost look to each other and say, like, hey, we're all in this together. We've got to figure out this all together, rather, because I think some of that, that like distancing from that past is like, we don't want our, you know, we want our caregivers to be bad or wrong or whatever. But it's like, but if they've got 3 or 4 generations of whatever, there was no way they had the tools to be able to do it in the first place. Like, it would be so great if at one point we all kind of agreed, okay, we are going to make things better.
And that means that we're not all okay. And that's okay that we're not all okay.
Right. Well,
That
and if you
doesn't
look
define
at
us.
world history, there's never really been a whole generation where there wasn't some type of world trauma happening.
Right. Right.
So that's that intergenerational trauma that, regardless of what was happening maybe on the micro level in their family, this macro level, what's happening in the world is impacting them.
Yeah.
And it's impacting their family.
Right. And we, at least in the US, we highly prize difficult things that don't bother us. I had this difficult thing and it didn't take me out, which is like, I think a little bit, at least biologically impossible, like kind of impossible.
Yeah. I've had some clients from the UK and they will say too, like, English people are masters at superficial, like chit chat.
Yep. Yeah.
So it looks like they also avoid going much deeper.
Yeah, totally.
And then I think our world is also set up to look for something external to solve internal issues.
Yep. Right. Well, we are heavily left brain, that we organize, we compare, we make an equation for, and this connection that we want, or this attachment that we want, is very right brained. It's very, there's not a set of rules to follow to need it. It's just like, that's what I loved about learning. Like, it is like your nervous system and your attachment system. Like, it's biologically a thing in your body. It's not it's a set of decisions. It's not a thought process.
I mean, when you think about the first 3 years of life, again, the first 3 years of life, we don't have a left brain.
Right. You don't.
We are right brain.
Right.
And can mom, typically it's mom.
Typically.
Or even, like, sometimes I will work with men who are their primary parent figure.
Right.
For whatever reason. And I'm like, I mean, I don't mean this to be just gendered, but you are mothering.
Right.
Those first 3 years of life, mothering is required. And if you can have multiple people doing it, that's good too, because like it's a really daunting task to mother,
right?
Especially if you have another kid, like that makes it even more difficult. And usually my male clients who played that role, they're like, yeah, no, I feel like I was mothering. Like, that's not typically how we describe fathering.
Right.
So that they can go with that concept. But yeah, that is like that parent has to be right brain to right brain with that child. And sometimes for parents, going right brain is too scary for them. That's where the trauma is. That's where the attachment wounds are. Those feelings were overwhelming for them, and which is why they kind of disconnected from all of that and bypassed it with intellectualism or organization or whatever that is.
Yep. A little list or somehow that says I'm okay, like some kind of list that says I'm okay. So, okay, well, that was great on the attachment. And if we want to talk about more of that, that's great. But I kind of wanted to move over a little bit about even just couples therapy with you a little bit and how that works. Okay. And so when somebody comes in as a couple, what is the goal? Like, because I think, as I was talking to Monty this morning, it was like, I think people think that like if you're going to go to couples therapy, then you're on the brink of divorce or there's a big old problem or whatever. But I'm like, I wonder if we could switch that, because like we've always talked about, it's like having a personal trainer, but for your marriage. Like it's more than just for conflict, but when somebody comes in, like from your perspective, your professional perspective, what is the goal with couples therapy?
I mean, I think the goal with any type of therapy, right, is to create a safe space. And I think there's a lot of therapists. I was fortunate in that some of my mentors were telling me this early on, and I did take training from Sue Johnson pretty early on, and the Gottmans. I'm just stumbling through my career early on, right? But I got some of these. Like, looking back, I think it had a profound impact. I mean, I was fairly young, and when I became a therapist, and B, I knew I needed help. Like, I did not know how to be a healthy person myself because of the way I grew up, right?
That's what we all,
So I was like, please teach me. And so I was looking for what I could learn and, how I could implement that. And then there were just some, places that I worked who would say, hey, there's this training. Do you want to go? And I'd be like, sure. They would pay for it. So I'm like, yeah, sure, I'll go. And it really, I think, shaped me as a therapist in ways that I wasn't fully aware of at the time. I knew it was shaping me as a person. But later, I maybe 10 years ago, I actually did all of Sue Johnson's official trainings. And that takes a little over a year. And, you know, we had to pass, I guess. We had to record a session with a couple and play it for the group and get feedback.
Is that EFT? Is that EFT? Yeah. Which stands for emotionally
focused therapy.
Therapy. Okay. Yes. Yes. Okay. Yeah.
And I felt like during it, I'm like, I think I understand it, but like the way it was being taught was not my way of learning. So I was just like, when I'm going to record, I'm like, I'm just going to do what I do. Like, I'm just gonna, right? Because I don't know, the way it was being taught, I'm just like, this is not how I learn. And so I felt like they were teaching it in a different language. And I was like, I don't speak that language. That is how I felt through it. Yeah. But I could get the concepts. I knew the concepts. And so I was just like with the couple, like, I don't know if I understand this. We're just going to go. We're just going to have a normal session recording it. And I'll get all the feedback that I need to afterwards. Right. And so I played it for the group. And the, you know, two facilitators who were there were like, you got it. That's exactly it. And I was like, okay, I don't know what I got. Right. But that's when I started thinking, I think I was young enough when I became a therapist and taking some of these trainings that it just shaped me. And I was just doing what I felt like I've always done. Yeah. But you right brained it. That's the thing, is you were like, okay, here's all these structures, but I'm just going to right brain it. And like, that's the thing about the right brain. It's unstructured. It's hard to like put it into words. It's hard to, as others are like, you got it, because we have to put it in a structure to describe it, but it's this right brain, unstructured feeling type of experience, really. Yeah. 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 So and my supervisor, right after graduating, so for a therapist, after you graduate, you have to be under supervision for so many hours. Like, so for me, it was 4,000 hours, which roughly equates to 2 years of full-time work. If longer, if you're not working full-time. I think the state of Utah just changed that to 3,000 hours. So maybe a year and a half of supervised work. So my supervisor, when I was a new therapist, was also really good and mentioned to me, like, your job is to connect with your client. Like, you have to attach to them because that's how you move them. And I was working at like a county mental health place. So the clients I was working with were usually court ordered. So it's a little unusual that in that setting, my supervisor would say that. Because also I could have like 96 people on my caseload. Wow. Obviously I wasn't seeing them all every week. Right. But that's not typically how we think of county mental health oriented. And so I think even hearing that and just trying to feel that with my clients and try to attach them, because I do think that is true. Like, when we can attune to them, that's where movement happens. Yeah. And I think sometimes for therapists, they're trying to give their clients a new idea. Or a tool, a new belief, a tip, or a new thought. Yep. But actually, we have to give them a different experience. I think it's safety. You create safety, and then that's what everybody needs to move forward, is that safety. And then I think when that therapist is safe over time, they're consistent with being safe and non-judgmental and curious, that starts to also develop some security. Yeah. That I can predict what's going to happen with this person. Right. Yeah. I remember thinking, because, like insurance companies, a lot of times were like, great, go to therapy for 6 sessions, and that's kind of what that was just like the norm for me. It wasn't, I ever even thought about it, but when working with you, it's like, by 6 sessions, I haven't even started to put down my defenses, like just meeting somebody new, like, think about, when you start dating somebody, even like you're still putting on the facade for long after 6 times of seeing them. Right. How do you even get movement? And so I think, a lot of people have been like, how you guys are still in therapy. And it's like, I give them 2 answers. I'm like, look, this is like having this coach teach you how to be in this relationship. And like, it's not like we come to you with, here's a problem, Jackie, tell us who's right. And
like, and then fix our fight. Like that hasn't been the way it is at all. But the other part is it's like, I get it. Like it took a long time. I mean, almost 6 months, I think, at least, before I wasn't like, what did she mean? Maybe even a year, where it's like, did she mean that for me? Like even still, sometimes we'll be like, I'll listen to your podcast. I'm like, is she talking about me? Like, and and then you go, okay, it's okay if you feel that way, but like, let's, but I mean, and it wasn't because you're not there. It's like, I think it takes time for our nervous system to have enough safety to share vulnerably, or to be open to feedback, or you're just on that guard. And so I think it's kind of a shame that we have this six and done a little bit within insurance companies, because I and especially in my world, the physical body and the emotional mental body are pretty much the same thing. So here we're going to say, okay, you can go to physical therapy 6 times, but if you're, you've broken your neck and you're in a wheelchair, you get 6 times. Like, it's not gonna, it's not the same. Now, maybe 6 times would be fine if you pulled a muscle, but it needs to be more individual for sure. But, and then
I think that's why you see a lot of therapists just moving away from insurance.
Yeah.
Because, and I've worked with insurance companies who really want to micromanage how therapy is going. And they are not even therapists. Right. That's strange. And they're telling me where I should be and where the client should be. And I'm just like, based on what? Right. Like, what are you basing this on? What page in your book are you looking at? Because like, black that out. That's not accurate. But they want to hold you to that place. And so, and how could that be? Everybody's so different. How could you possibly? I don't think we want to see it that way. Right. And I think seeing people as a one size fits all, and you just do A, B, C, and D, that would be much more efficient. But like, efficiency can be a problem if that should not be the goal all the time. Right. No, because I mean, and that's the thing, working in that first job, like, we're talking, they are coming to you because of they should have had therapy a long time ago. Like when it rises up, when all of these things that we have going on, these attachment wounds and the family system wounds, when they bubble up, it's rough. It can be rough, and it impacts many people a lot of times. So it's like, I feel like it's like more efficient to do the big work. Let's do it's going to take a while for us to all do this big work, but like the long-term benefits are just out of, like, I can't even think of how big they would be. I can imagine. So in the couples therapy, we teased about that, but how does it feel like with couples that they kind of do want you to kind of take a side? How do you deal with that in a couple session? How, like, for instance, 2 questions. 1, how do you deal with it? And 2, what would you say to the couple to like try and get out of that place? Because it's tempting. Like, it's tempting. Yeah. And I can feel it when they're wanting me to pick sides. Yes. Yeah. So it's similar when you're working with a couple as it is with the individual. You just have 2 people you have to attune to. And again, for some therapists, if they're trying to teach them a new idea, and again, sometimes when I'm telling newer therapists, like, it's called an interpersonal approach, meaning we're attuning to them and moving them through that safety, but we're moving them with our nervous system. Because that's how regulation happens. It's when we are young, we are co-regulating. We need somebody else to regulate us as an infant. And sometimes, depending on what's going on for mom or dad, they actually dysregulate us. And that's like what gets wired in. That's going to feel anxious. Connection feels anxiety producing. Right. Because it did not regulate me. It dysregulated that infant, right? Like, if you've ever, as a parent, if you are really stressed and the baby's crying, and so you like pick up the baby to try to calm them down, but you're very stressed, and all of a sudden the baby just like crying escalates, right? And you're like, oh my gosh. And it's like, fortunately for me as a mom, I also learned really early as a therapist that, like, put the baby down, take some breaths, regulate yourself, then pick up the baby and soothe the baby.
Yeah.
But I first have to soothe me because that baby is plugging into my nervous system, and my nervous system is dysregulated. So the baby's already dysregulated. They plug into my nervous system to co-regulate, and they're like, ah, this does not feel good.
Right. It feels like the worst feeling you could possibly understand, but you're a baby. Yeah. And we talked a lot about that co-regulating and how it, and so that's why I'm like, whether you're, the mothering, whoever does the mothering, I mean, I think, wow, how we could, like, these need to be our top priority. And some other countries, they've done this better than we have, where they realize that those first 3 years, as much as they possibly can, it's like all hands on deck for this mom, because we invest in her being okay to regulate her child. And the long-term results of that make the countries much safer, less crime, less poverty.
I mean, they're happier. Their people are happier overall.
Yep.
But that's not the most efficient model.
Right. Oh, it's not efficient at all, as far as our definition of it.
Right.
Our definition of it. But I mean, how do you put a price on safety in your communities, about crime, how do you put a price on happiness? It would take a huge overhaul, but that's the sad thing, is we have some data. We literally, it's not something that hasn't been done, but this, and I wish I would have known this growing up. Not growing up, raising my kids growing up too, but how important that was. Cause I think, if I look back, it was more about like, I gotta teach this kid to be this way, and now it's interesting having a grandbaby to be like, you know what, I don't need to teach them squat. Like, I just need to be connected with them. And it's really interesting to see, and maybe it's his temperament or whatever, but he is, because I feel like he has this safe base, he learns, he walked at 9 months, things like literally his physical development, I feel like sped up because he had this, this thing. And I watched my grandkid, or my kids that had him, to just those first, almost up to the year. And they automatically get on a schedule, but it was just, they just lived by him. And you can see that security in him, that he's like, and then he has that safety to explore. And it's just been really, really interesting to see that from a perspective, like in real life, of what can happen when you give the safety to little babies, little kids.
Well, and like we were talking about, this is all going into because of his age, this is a sense he has that his world is safe. He's safe in his world. The people in his life are safe.
Yeah.
They're watching him. They're letting him explore, but they're watching him in case he's doing something scary, which is what allows him to explore, right? Because if I'm exploring in the wrong way, and again, these are not thoughts at his age. No. This is just a sense. So we go back into that sense, right? That's that core self. And that can get overridden pretty quickly.
Yeah. Pretty quickly. Yeah. And by simple things. Yeah. And very young. Totally. Yeah. And like I said, I could see that in my own self. It was like tired, you're pregnant and you're not the best mom if you're pregnant. And I think if I would have just known that, like out in the forefront, it's like, hey, I need to take care of myself so that I can take care of them better instead of sacrificing more and more or whatever. Like it just, again, it was a sense too. It wasn't like a decision, but if I had that information, I would do things very differently, I think.
Well, and sometimes, because like I had that awareness, I had that knowledge, but two of my kids, my second and third, were like 14, 15 months apart.
Right.
That was never the plan.
Right.
And like when I found out I was pregnant with my third, I had missed my whole first trimester. And I'm like telling my doctor, like, I have a master's degree. I'm not stupid. I just had a baby. So I was like recovering from the baby. Right. And so my second daughter is like, I would tell her, like, you are one of those like sensitive, beautiful souls. And our world does a number on those people. But I would also have to explain to her, and it was just true. So I would tell her, like, she did develop some anxiety. And I would say to her, like, hey, when you were little, I had another baby.
Mm-hmm.
And also my third was born a month early. So that made it even closer, right? I was like, I didn't know I was pregnant until I was 4 months along, and then she came in a month early.
Wow.
But
that's a lot. That's a
yes.
lot.
And daughter number 3 is just a fierce, like, go-getter.
Mm-hmm.
Like, she's not the easy temperament child.
Right.
And so, you know, like, she started walking at 9 months.
Mm-hmm.
She potty trained at like 14 months.
Right.
And a lot of that was like seeing this older sister when you take
Mm-hmm.
her to the bathroom. And I mean, she potty trained camping of all places. And she's just like, we're like, no, you got a diaper, just go in your diaper. No, I need big girl pants. And we're like, well, we don't have any, we'll get them when we're back. And she's like, she has them. And we're just like, oh. So it was just that, like, I'm taking this, this, right?
Right. Which you don't want to stifle, but when you have a sensitive, the other one's sensitive, it's going to make a difference in their lives. Yeah.
And so I would tell her, like, that was kind of rocky from a young age for you.
Mm-hmm.
And just having this sister who had a very different temperament than you, like, it's not that her temperament is bad or no, right. Is bad,
right?
But they were very different to be so close together,
and
that probably didn't feel good to you. And I was completely overwhelmed as a mom to have basically 2 babies, but not all like at the same pace.
Right. Yeah.
And
trust me, little Casey's 14 months. You had a brand new baby. Woo!
Right. Yes.
Yeah.
So just having to own that, like, here's some of the origin sources of your early years. And there were times that I'm rocking you to bed to go to sleep, and I would cry. And I'm sure that wasn't like, it just spilled out.
Right.
And yeah, that probably didn't help you as a little baby.
Yeah.
And
because her nervous system's going to feel that. Yeah. That's just the way it's
going to feel my overwhelm. It's going to feel like, so I'm just like, yeah, that's there. And you know, I would tell her, like, we've saved for therapy. That's what I can do.
Yep.
You have a college fund, you have a therapy fund.
Yeah.
Different types of education.
Different types. And that's the thing is, like, I mean, I think one of the biggest barriers is because I think, you know, that maybe it's that left brain, but we want to find fault. And it's like, if we could kind of push fault off and just say, because the thing is it was different. Maybe had those 2 kids been switched, it'd be totally different. Like, we just have to understand. And that's why, you know, that sense of self, that understanding of ourselves is so powerful, because it's just like, it doesn't matter what I was supposed to have. It matters what I needed, you know, like and my needs are going to be different than the next person's needs. And that's like normal. That's healthy. But we want it to be like, it's fine with him, so what's your problem? You know, and it's that doesn't even, that's not even a thing. That's kind of strange.
So in therapy, when we're trying to give our clients an experience, that's as close as we can get to that sense.
Right.
That happens early in life, before language is known, before, like, a lot of that stuff is going on. And it's just this felt sense of the world and my place in it, and whether that feels safe or not. You know, and so going in and the tuning and having a sense of the therapist, and that's how we're building trust. And then you have to do that with 2 people who don't always have that trust with each other, and you know, are wanting you to pick a side, and you're just like, I that's not how this is going to work. I can't pick sides.
Right.
I have to connect with each of your nervous systems and make sense of it.
Yeah.
And what's going on, and what are these wounds that are showing up here?
Yes. And each of you have your own separate needs that we don't need to decide which one's better than the other. Like, that's just not an avenue we even need to go down. And so, another couple of questions. So what was a skill, if you could say, what is a skill that, or what would really be something that people probably don't know, maybe, but that would really improve their relationships? You know, in all the couples that you see, what is one thing that kind of shows up over and over again? What is something that would be helpful?
one of the things I know I say a lot, because my staff will repeat it, clients will start repeating it and picking it up. And so I think it's helpful, is I will always say, all behavior makes sense.
Right.
It might drive you crazy.
Right.
Whether it's your own behavior or your partner's, but it makes sense. And if it doesn't make sense and you're like, how in the world can this make sense? You got to start figuring that out.
Right.
And you, like, if this is your partner, you've got to put yourself into what you know, like this is that perspective taking. Okay, here's what I know of their family. How did their family feel when I was first meeting them? How did their family feel to me today? Okay, so now I'm my partner and I'm putting like what I know of him and his temperament and I'm putting that in. Oh, I get it. Yeah. And but that can take time, because often you're just like, yeah, you do that for me. And then I'll do it for you. And sometimes couples get stuck in that, like, well, you go first. Right. And then I'll follow. And it's like, well, we need both of you doing this, right? Because now we're in this waiting game. And so again, you'll, in the session, you'll see some of those occurring patterns. And I mean, I've been doing it enough that I can have a ballpark guesstimate of what happened. Right. But I want them to give it to me. I want them to discover that. Right. My ballpark guesstimate might shape the answers or the questions that I ask, but they need to come up with those answers in their body. Right. And initially, usually I'll meet with some resistance. Yeah, for sure. Because again, they don't want to go to those places. Right. I'll give you an example. Like, I remember my mom being frustrated at my dad, or, like, and what's funny is, like, she's telling, I don't know who was there. I don't know if she ever told this to my actual dad, right? Which is like problem number one. But I remember just being like, this is just burned to my brain. She was just like, sometimes I'll put things, we had like just a upstairs and then a basement, right? So she's like, sometimes I put things like at the stairs and he'll just walk past and not pick him up and take it down the stairs. And I remember just going, and that means what? Like, you could tell that within herself, that meant he doesn't care about her. He doesn't, all this stuff. Yeah. And it was like, Mom, like, what, like, what do you, I didn't ask her, what do you, and what does that mean to you? Which I would have said at this point, like, and so tell me what that means to you. Cause there's a lot of assumption that happens. Yes. And, and what do you assume that he's trying to tell you? And number two, so it's like the fact that he didn't take him downstairs, like, let's get curious about why he didn't do that, like, and maybe it's like, because I'm chauvinistic and I think women should do the work. I don't care, but like, there is a reason why, right. Rather than going off on this tangent of what it means about me, and he's doing this on purpose, and all this definition, all this layers and layers of stuff that, like, if they were to come into therapy, all of that's got to be, dealt through when it's not really even the deeper issue. Right. Well, and like you said, there are a lot of assumptions made. Yep. That then say this person that I've partnered with and built a life with is a threat to me. Yeah. And so those assumptions usually are about the other person. We're not assuming things about why I'm making this person a threat. Right. 100%. Sad, but true. Which goes back to those early experiences. Yeah. Of this didn't feel safe. Right. Because as a child, it was supposed to be all in your favor. Like, it wasn't, you weren't supposed to make it, you didn't have the capability to decide what was needed and what wasn't. It was not, it wasn't even developed. That wasn't there. Yeah. So somebody with that fearful or that avoidant attachment style, if you can get them past the initial, like, present, talking about, like, okay, so stuff. So let's go to that 10-year-old self. Tell me that 10-year-old self, what's happening for him and how does he feel? And again, sometimes they'll say, I don't want to see him. I don't want to engage with him. Okay. How, like, can you tell me more about that? Like, what's that about? And sometimes my clients will, at the end of that type of session, will say, I'm sorry, I wasn't trying to be disagreeable. Right. And I'm like, I know, like, I mean, I don't think you knew when I was asking you to do this, that would be your response. Right.
You're being
but
honest.
we're in our body and we're
Yeah.
going in that nervous system, and you're like, I don't want to look at him.
Mm-hmm.
And,
Yep.
you know, and sometimes a session or two later, they're like, you know, and we've talked about like what was happening for him, or,
Mm-hmm.
you know, with some of my clients, they're like, yeah, I'm repulsed by that kid.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, let's talk about that. And
Mm-hmm.
sometimes it's just, you know, he just was on his own.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And so I don't know how to go in and talk to him. And I'm like, you do.
Mm-hmm.
Like, that was you.
Mm-hmm.
You know best how he's feeling.
Mm-hmm.
And you know best what he needs to hear.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I want them to do that with that younger self, right?
Yep.
Like, I mean, I will engage with the adult self
Mm-hmm.
and coach them if they need some help, or if they get
Mm-hmm.
stuck, I'll engage with them. I don't typically engage with that younger self. I want
Mm-hmm.
them to engage with that younger self.
Yep.
And they
Yeah.
know the information. I can guess, but I don't always know it.
Mm-hmm.
And so, you know, often I'll say like, yeah, you were the adult that younger child always needed.
Mm-hmm.
And they're like, yeah, and it took me 8 years of therapy.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, yeah.
Yeah.
And aren't you glad we're there?
Yeah. And sometimes when I'm with a client and they're like, I can't, I'm almost sometimes I would rather have that than, because sometimes I can tell that they're looking at me as authority figure and trying to obey me. And I'm like, no, you know, I'm not, I don't want you to listen to me and obey me. It's okay if you're, you know, so when they're like, I can't, I'm almost like a little bit, okay, you know, a little bit like, okay, good. Then we know where we're at. I'd rather have them say I can't than like, you know, go into this
Force
part.
it.
Yeah. And force it and have it be all anxious and be nervous and stuff like that. So yeah,
and again,
that
sometimes
happens.
when you can get into that, there's something like maybe unknown or subconscious, we would say, that is engaging, and they know where to go. They know what to do. Or even as a couple, if you can start to get them talking at that level, they know how to have those conversations.
Yep.
And it's just that vulnerability invites vulnerability.
Yep.
But it can take a long time to feel safe going vulnerable, right? For both people. And so, because sometimes that one person maybe can go a little bit vulnerable and the other person's like, I don't know who that is.
Right.
Like, I've never seen that person. And they're mad about it.
Right.
You know, so again,
the plan. Yeah.
I've recently been thinking, and I was talking to one of our men's groups about this, like the concepts of resistance and dissent. And dissent is typically a little bit more informed and intentional. And resistance is that's uncomfortable.
Right. Right. One is more about knowing yourself, and that doesn't resonate. And the other one's like, I'm not going there.
Yeah.
Not touching that. Yeah.
And I think I have several clients in that space right now where they're finally connecting to this story and saying like, I don't think that's accurate.
Right.
Which is dissent. They're saying, I don't think that's true.
Right.
I don't think I ever felt that way.
Yes.
But we had to get past that resistance.
Yes. And that's very different than feeling like I've got to go in and blame my mom. You know, and it's like, no, it's not that. This is just, hey, getting to that point where it's like, no, I needed this, you know, like it's just a totally different energy. Totally. That makes so much sense. Okay. So one last little part that I wanted to get while you're on here is when it comes for couples coming to therapy, you know, how important is it to have the divorce on the table? Or, you know, like we were talking this morning, it was like, you know, some people pledged we're never going to, you know, address that word. I have friends who are like, that does not fit in our language. You know, that doesn't fit. So I just wanted to kind of riff off of that a little bit. Like, what is your idea about how that shows up? Because I think that's one of the barriers to couples therapy is it feels like, well, we're not to divorce yet, so we don't need to go to therapy.
Yeah. Well, that's a hard place to get to too. If they are ready for divorce,
right,
and then they show up, you're like,
right.
Okay, how much space do I have here to work?
Right.
I can't do this in 3 sessions. Like you're not going to get enough if you're like giving it 3 sessions before you divorce.
Right.
I can't. I'm not a miracle worker.
Right.
Sometimes I do get those couples, and I'm like, okay, can I at least get them to consider a pause? And I just give you more time. But often people couples will come in. One person is a little bit more animated about being there.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe not excited. Sometimes they're more angry about being there.
Gotcha. Mm-hmm.
Like even sometimes they initiated coming, but they are angry.
They're taking up most of the talk in the session, kind of thing. Yeah. Okay.
And typically I will know, like, I got to get them feeling safe before this partner is going to talk to me.
Right.
Like, because this is, and usually I'll say, has this been happening for a while? Is this what typically happens outside of our sessions? Right. Because I mean, I'm assuming that what I see in sessions is some view of what happens outside of sessions.
Right.
And so usually they'll behave a little bit more because again, most people who go to therapy want their therapist to like them.
Right. Totally.
Which is, I think, where that like pick my side comes from. But that's not really getting to know you.
Right.
Like picking sides can be done very intellectually.
Totally. Yeah. Right.
But that's not actually, that's not actually what they're looking for.
Right.
They're wanting to understand themselves and be accepted.
Right. They want to be, totally. Yeah. And so it sounds like, you've got those people that are like, we're on the verge of a divorce, help us. Or there's those people maybe that come in and like, well, we're not even going to consider that. And both of those are maybe in an unhealthy.
Yeah. Or sometimes I've had couples come in premarital counseling, but they don't even know what problems are going to pop up sometimes.
Right.
I mean, I might ask some questions and give them some advice, but they're still in that romantic stage of, well, we're getting married, and that'll never happen to us. We wouldn't have sexual problems.
Right.
And I'm
like,
oh, okay, great. Like, I don't know maybe you won't, I don't know. But at least I have my card.
At least that's why I like to tell those people, I'm like, let me tell you a little story. So me and my husband were on the same day in the same hospital. Like we met because, like there's so many factors that make it like a fairy tale. And it's just, and the difficulties come. I don't even care if you have a fairy tale life, they can pop up, whether it's because, something new pops in, maybe even, like that can be something, a terminal illness can make it hard for relationships to, any kind of change, let alone all of our childhood stuff, which is big, but yeah, that's a deal. That's a deal to do that. So, all right. Well, we always ask our guests, just to tell us a little bit about their ideas and things about wholeness. So when it comes to your work and what you do, how would that word fit in, and what is your definition and thoughts about wholeness?
Yeah. I mean, so I specialize. I mean, this isn't the only client population I work with. We'll get just trauma, but our specialty is addiction, and specifically sex addiction and betrayal trauma. From there, we can work with infidelity. We'll work with trauma. A lot of times people who resonate with our website, but nothing about addiction, discover one of their parents was a sex addict, and they just didn't have that awareness, but something resonated with them. I mean, we can do that trauma work, but usually in that there is some addiction that pops up, which is always interesting to me. And I didn't want to go into addiction. I've been in the field 32 years. That was the last thing I wanted to work in.
Right.
And, like I just say, like sometimes your calling comes. And for me, I was headed the wrong direction, and it grabbed me by the shirt collar and kind of drugged me back and was like, here, you're going to work here. And I was like, okay, they give me insurance day one. I haven't been to the dentist because I've been a poor student. So I'll take this job, right?
Right.
And here I am 32 years later, still working in addiction. So with wholeness, I would say I get a lot of people who, if we talk about integrity, they hate that conversation. But the way I'm approaching integrity is things got fractured. And when things are fractured, you're not going to have integrity. Often we talk like the integrity that they are resisting is this integrity of you should have integrity. But we don't break it down into like, okay, if people get fractured, if there's attachment wounds, if they're adapting and they're not living in that core essence of who they are, then of course they're going to act out of their value, out of alignment with their values. They're going to act in ways that they're ashamed of. And so for me and for the clinicians who work with me, I will say, like, our job is to get this person back to an integrated person. And when they are an integrated person, they can live a meaningful life. And so I think that's that wholeness. We would say it's integrated, like all of the different parts of themselves. They have understanding, they have acceptance, they have an inner peace now. They know if something gets triggered, they can understand why, but it doesn't really overtake them. They're not acting compulsively. For the partners, they're starting to understand the addiction piece. A lot of times they will say, like, I didn't choose that, which they may not have. But often we find that there's some addict in the partner's life as well that maybe they didn't know about, or, but I mean, it takes us time to get to this question where we ask the partner, like, what about your story makes sense that you married an addict and didn't know that, right? Like, because that's got to there's somewhere there that makes sense. Obviously we're not asking that up front because that would not feel safe to them, and that would feel judgmental.
Right.
But I think for so many people, they are hoping, and that's not how we get to a meaningful life. That's not how we get to a positive self-image. And again, this positive self-image is not arrogant. It's not like cocky or dominating. Like, often I will say to them, like, when you get to that inner essence of who you are, it's going to feel like a breath of fresh air. Like, it's going to be like, this is me. This makes sense. This is who I am. And it's like we were saying at the beginning, like it always feels good, because I just don't think people are born bad.
Right.
I mean, we used to have that belief. Maybe some people still do, but I think in the field of psychology, we're not at that place anymore. So I think as we work towards that integration and understanding why we did what we did, how we got where we are, why we are the way we are, and then giving permission to really connect back to that inner essence and have experiences with that. And sometimes initially that's having that experience with a therapist, and then being able to take that into a relationship with the partner. And we just start to see more integration happening there, where, you're not a perfect person. And even now that you're integrated, you're still going to make mistakes, but the mistakes don't feel like they're so out of alignment with who you are. They're just mistakes.